G'day there, James here. I'm going to be reading a small article I posted on Facebook called The Hubris of Humility, and then I'm going to demonstrate this in action with a conversation I had on Facebook Messenger. The Hubris of Humility. Humility is to behave inferiorly to your actuality, and arrogance is to behave superiorly to your actuality. Paradoxically, humility makes one arrogant. When the humble faithfully behave as less than what they are, as one cannot reasonably behave as less, it must be via faith, and whenever another exposes this truth, they attack the idea that reason can ever supersede faith and abuse the messenger of rationality. Faith leads to humility, and humility is synonymous with self-deprecation. When one treats themselves with such little respect, they become fractured. Any attempt to enlighten them to their true power and potential is seen as a threat to their original choice, which was to abandon their pride and embrace subservience to higher powers, whether secular or supernatural, meaning government or religion. If their original choice to demean themselves and acquiesce to minds above their own was wrong, well, that means that many of their following actions were also wrong. This is terrifying for them. So most choose to evade rather than face the truth, unable to awaken their dormant courage. The one who humiliates themselves via humility falsely believes that their faith is above reason, that they are above reason, that their feelings surpass reality. Because if they don't believe this, they have to confront the shame and guilt of being wrong, that there is no legitimate power above them. By their choice to descend into a pre-intellectual state of being, they must also believe they are better than those who acknowledge that the facts of reality are independent of one's subjective feelings. It's a simple defense mechanism to preserve their chosen reality fallacy and to avoid the responsibility of thinking for oneself. The humble then accuse those who dare to try and save them from their own irrationality as arrogant and flawed, whilst being totally ignorant of their own hubris to utter such inconsistent contradictions. So ironically, the humble become arrogant whenever someone reasonable, prideful, and caring attempts to pull them up into the clarity of objective reality, not beneath any other, nor above them, but as equals. So sometimes when I talk to people, they accuse me of being arrogant and say that I always try and just be the teacher, that I'm not a good student, and that I'm not open-minded and willing to learn. Which is totally incorrect, totally false. I'm always learning. It's just that these specific people who feel the need to throw such insults just have nothing to teach me, except for where they are wrong. I learn a lot from just seeing the errors and seeing the erroneous perspectives of people who are trapped in subjective fantasy and who have succumbed to the logical fallacy of faith, the incorrect epistemological method of identifying reality through subjective arbitrary whims and feelings and appealing to authority, whether through a book or a talking head on the TV, or their own inner voice, which they mistakenly assume for the voice of God. And then they humble themselves, get on their hands and knees and pray to this voice inside their head, which they think is coming from some extra-dimensional supernatural entity, beyond time and space and beyond all kind of logic and reason. So it definitely shows me a lot about erroneous points of thinking. And for that, I am grateful. I do appreciate that. I really do. I learn a lot. But it's in spite of what they're saying. It's not as a direct result of what they're saying. Because when someone knows more about a topic than me, well, obviously I'm all ears. But when people pretend and they think they know more, it's really sad. It really does upset me. And it's why I make these videos, to help point out people's errors, including my own, obviously, so then you don't make that same mistake. And we can all be better tomorrow. So I had this guy who believes in Christianity and believes in religion, so has humbled himself through the act of faith and has abandoned the power of his own mind. But yet somehow he thinks he's clinging to his own mind and using logic, even though all of his beliefs are in utter contradiction of logic, which I try to point out time and time again. And the first thing he sent me via message was just basically a bunch of assumptions and insults. So I let that slide and just told him he was incorrect. And this was specifically about the topic of God beginning. And I thought, okay, how about I start off trying to be relatable? And I said to him, I believed in God before. I've done that. I've been there, done that. I found better arguments against the idea. I don't stay married to that which is wrong. I don't care about being wrong because I have pride. I can take it. I don't feel ashamed when I discover I've been wrong. And this has happened plenty of times. I care about knowing what's true more than protecting a fragile ego. I don't feel threatened by the possibility of being wrong. I feel threatened by the possibility of believing lies and doing nothing about it. And then I sent him a playlist because I always feel it's a good idea to send resources and say, well, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. You can lead a man to knowledge, but you can't make him think. Boom, that even rhymes too. And I'm not a rhymer. So I said, that's a great playlist which helped me see that the idea of God is logically not one based in reality. And I know it can be scary and uncomfortable to think you're alone, but really it's just a great way to grow up and be strong. And so he replied back with something reasonable, and he said, when you say once you believed in God, did you have a connection, relationship to such a thing? Who was God to you at that time? What turned you away? And so I answered and I said, I thought it was a logical answer to the question of what is this? How was this created? If I don't submit and obey, will I suffer in hell? I kept thinking and questioning and saw that the concept of God, not just the Christian God, was invalid. I mean, it really is super easy to debunk Yahweh, that Christian God, out of the Old and New Testament. You can do that in seconds. But it's harder to debunk the concept of God just as a whole. I looked at all the arguments and saw that the counter-arguments were just always better. I don't have all the ultimate answers, but I don't need to know everything to know what's not true. If a stronger argument for the existence of God came up, I'd change my mind. But at this point, I simply see no evidence for the concept. And so continuing on this point about this conversation about God, how it starts off, and I'm reading it to you to show you what humility and faith can do to a man to make them what could potentially be greatness and glorious into uselessness and just brokenness, fractured, with potentially no hope of salvation. And by salvation, I mean growing up to become a reasonable man, not staying stuck as a humble human. Human as in the color of man, less than man, humble. That's what they do. They bow down, they get on their knees and they kowtow to a higher power, which there is zero evidence for. Only the appeal to authority, which is coming from a book. It's shocking. So I said to him, he said some other stuff about God, we'll skip over. The teaching of all religions go against what I teach about individual sovereignty. You really only can be sovereign or not. If there really was an intelligent God, I'm sure he would prefer I use the homage of my reason and intellect than behave with blindfolded fear and obedience. You can't have two masters. It's either you or it's not. And I don't see anything as more disrespectful than rejecting yourself. And yes, I know you're going to say it's not like that. It's not like you're rejecting yourself if you get down on your knees and beg and worship to God. But no, it is. Undeniably, incontestably, it is. Either you're the boss of you or you're not. You don't have the right to let another own you, to have a higher authority than you, as then you become that thing's puppet, that thing's toy. And this is immoral. You must always be in control of yourself to the fullest and be accountable for your actions. If you do good, you get the credit. If you do evil, you are culpable. If another is above you, then it's an excuse to blame them. This is wrong. So I just want to point out some of the silly, mistaken, erroneous things he said. Not to put him down here, but I think it's useful to show other people's mistakes so then you don't fall into that same trap. And so he said here, because we started talking about quantum physics and I was saying how it's a bullshit psyop. And it really is just a philosophical attack on your metaphysics and epistemology to get you to believe subjective nonsense. And he says, time and space are only even possible due to our plane of existence. There are other dimensions where past, present, and future are all connected, so they say. And so I thought about that for half a second. I was like, what? What are you talking about, man? It's like, clearly, past, present, and future are all connected in this reality. You don't need to go to another dimension to experience that. We have now, and before this now I was reading out this guy's message. That was the past, that's connected to the present now. I couldn't have got here now if the past wasn't connected. And then I'm going to be talking into the future, they're all connected. So it's just these silly little things that don't make sense, that are just being repeated from quantum physicists and strange people on the internet. Oh, that's not a good argument to say strange people on the internet, because I could be considered a strange person on the internet to you if you've never come across me before, but I think you know what I mean there. And so this is more quantum physics bullshit that's infected his mind. He says consciousness and awareness are two separate things. A thing has a consciousness, like a table or a chair, has consciousness but not awareness. And I was like, dude, what? And he also continues, we as humans both have both consciousness and awareness. And on top of that, we are conscious because we see that we are aware. And he says, existence equals consciousness. This is shown through quantum physics. And so I said to him, well, quantum physics is not physics. And I'm trying to say this in the nicest possible way to point out the errors, but not to put him down too much. Quantum physics is not physics. It has nothing to do with it. It's pseudoscience. It's just the latest attack on man's philosophy, specifically metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics being the study of existence as a whole. That's what that is. And epistemology is the study of how do we know what we know. And the answer is by reason, by logic, not by any other method. Impossible. It's more of the same subjective primacy of conscious fallacy. Because that's what quantum physics is. It's based on the primacy of consciousness, which is the same as New Age bullshit and religion with God. Just another false religion. None of it's provable. All their experiments are fake, just like the HIV and COVID PCR tests. Fake tests. And he just said, nope, strongly disagree. And I said, a table is not conscious. Only life can be conscious. A table is not alive. Existence is not conscious. But beings who are alive within existence have the ability to be conscious. And even then, it doesn't seem to be very commonplace. And he asked me, what is it about quantum physics that you don't see as legit? Good question. And I said, all of it. It tries to say that inanimate matter is conscious. And he says, didn't know that. I'm like, you were arguing for it. You just said tables and chairs are conscious. And I said, quantum physics teaches that subjective consciousness, observation, and perspective alone without action can alter reality. I continue here and I say the whole concept of tables and rocks, which are unalive matter, being conscious, is from quantum physics. And then I continue to say belief is trust without reason to trust, without knowledge or evidence. And he says, nah, I believe my fireplace is keeping my house warm. Am I right or not? And I continue, I'm not answering him yet, but continuing on my thread. And I'm saying that quantum physics says that a tree doesn't fall in the woods unless someone is standing there to witness it. It's nonsense. That's crazy to believe that. And I said, that's crazy to believe that your fireplace is keeping you warm. That's literally crazy. Why would you believe that your fireplace is keeping you warm? You're certain of it. You know the fireplace is keeping you warm. Because it's hot, it's fire. You learned that as a child. Don't put your hand on the stove or in the fire. It's hot, it hurts. Why would you believe that? You only believe something when you don't have any evidence, when there's no facts, no reason to substantiate your ideas, your convictions. When you know something, why is belief necessary? It's not. You only believe when you don't know but wish for something to be true based on feelings, not evidence. And so he said, okay, hold up, let me think about that. I'm a bit slow, you know. I love this, by the way, thank you. Okay, good. Finally, we're getting somewhere. Awesome. That's great. And I said, yeah, I hope you're getting something out of it. And so I told him that consciousness is the same as awareness. Consciousness is your faculty of awareness. It's how you know you exist and can perceive your internal self and the external world. Because if you weren't conscious, well, need I explain more? You wouldn't know you exist. There wouldn't even be a you then. It'd be a series of programs that aren't self-aware. It'd be like a computer. So he continues on and he starts talking from a rationalistic perspective. And in philosophy, rationalism is essentially deduction in a void. It's only abstract ideas disconnected from reality with no observable evidence. And I'll give an example. He says, time and space are in a linear grid of reality. It's like, what do you even mean by that? You can say time is linear, because past, present, future, but what do you mean space is linear? And he had no proper answer for this. And it's probably because, well, either I don't understand and he just didn't explain it, or it's just some nonsense that was repeated by some quantum physics professor who's just a nutcase. But he says here, the idea of creating a wormhole manipulates time and space. Yeah, in Star Trek, in Star Wars, that shit isn't real in reality. If it was, do you think they'd be talking about it? Why would the cabal let you know that they are able to do that? Hell no, they wouldn't. They make TV shows about it and make you think that, because then you start believing subjective nonsense and you wouldn't think there's an objective morality, and then you would just bend over and be humble and allow the cabal to take control, and you wouldn't resist. Because you're like Jesus and you just turn the other cheek and you invite them to keep on abusing you. And you bow down and So I say actions can alter reality, but not perception. Your perception doesn't change reality, which is what quantum physics is about. And he says, perception absolutely alters reality. And I'm like, no, I reply, that's quantum physics nonsense. And he says, well, perhaps not our shared reality. And I reply and I say, well, that's what reality is. We don't live in our own isolated universes. As much as that would be nice, we have to share it with each other, at least in this dimension. But in other dimensions, hopefully, it's different. But we can only go off what we know now. And he says, I think we have a shared reality, and I think we have an indivisible reality. How else can we be individuals having our own experience otherwise? Well, very easily. And I say, well, a wormhole is just a theory based on pseudoscience in Star Trek. It's not real. It has no actual basis in reality, but sure is a cool sci-fi concept. And he says, it's like these lefties when they talk about truth. They believe there isn't a common truth. They only believe in individual truth. It's like, well, that's right, but that's exactly what you're doing. And you don't even realize it, because your epistemological method is faith, and faith has led you to be humble, and humility has led you to erroneous objective cognition. Well, it's not even objective, you can't even call it objective cognition, it's erroneous subjective cognition instead of objective cognition. Because that's what we want, that's the ultimate goal, is to think objectively, is to think properly, to think in alignment with the way the world and reality actually is. Not what we want to believe, not what we pretend to believe, or we hope, or we feel, or we've read, or we think, but what we know. We're going to learn objective cognition. Just because we have an individual identity And consciousness doesn't mean reality is split into billions of pieces. And so he said in reply to when I said a wormhole is just a theory based on Star Trek, he said, this is where I think you need to look deeper. It's like, okay. And I said, well, it means there is one reality with billions of living beings coexisting inside of it. And he says here, because he sent me a podcast, he said that podcast about Stargate I shared, it's like 6 hours long, government programs, secret shit. So it's 6 hours long about like extremely secretive technology that the government would kill people if they spoke about it, but it's 6 hours long of people diverging this information. Yeah, I don't see the contradiction. And so he continues on explaining this podcast, and he says he's a guy who says he worked for huge secret government departments where this guy uses his ability to travel in other planes of reality in order to find shit. Astral projection. There's heaps of stuff out there in that, well documented. How do you reconcile that info? And it's like, another reason why I'm doing this is because I've been suckered into believing this nonsense as well. I watched this whole secret space program with Corey Goode and David Wilcock on Gaia. And it's multiple series, but it's like, think about it. If this, and even those people who talk in these videos say, I was threatened that if I spoke out, my family and I would be killed. And I know they would do it, but yet I'm still speaking out. It's like, no, if you did, you'd be killed. That's what those people do if it's that sensitive. And I'm not saying it's absolutely impossible for there to be whistleblowers. I'm just saying when it comes to extremely sensitive information, you really have to question. You have to say, is this believable? Is there really evidence for this, or does it just sound fucking cool and I want to believe it? Because I know that frame of mind. I've been there. I've done that. And I said in reply to that guy who's revealing his opinions, truth, I said, well, yeah, maybe, but you can't just take his word on it. Anyone can say anything. It doesn't mean it's true. And he says, well, when you've watched like 100 different sources, or 100 different stories from all different sources, you start to get to an idea. And I say, well, yeah, sure, I agree with that. You can then slot it into the realm of possible. But until you have proof, it's not certain. And so he says here, and so, what? Because it didn't happen to you, it doesn't exist? Which is an odd line of thought. And I reply and I say, well, trying to explain to him in a kind way the stupidity of that question. It's like when I talk to people directly, I don't say you're stupid, you're dumb, and call out all these insults. It's like, I'm not talking to this guy anymore because he's unteachable. So therefore, I will say things like, that's stupid, that's dumb. I'm not talking directly to someone. I'll call out Christians for being childish, immature fools, for not changing their minds and not wanting to grow up and learn the truth. But I'm not saying that directly to someone. There's a big difference between making a video and posting on the internet compared to talking face-to-face to someone. There's a big difference. So I've said to him, I wasn't, and we're going over what he said, and so what, because it didn't happen to you, it doesn't exist. It's like, that's a silly thing to believe or to even question. I wasn't there to invent the internet. I really don't know how it works, so therefore I don't believe in it. It sounds silly, doesn't it? Because obviously that's not true. And he says, my thinking is you've not looked deep and long enough. Is that fair? And I said, no, it's an unbased assumption. On what grounds is your assumption based? And so he asked me, have you ever done psychedelics? And he says, I bet you experience stuff you can't explain. And I told him, I've done DMT. I smoked DMT. And I said, that was the wackiest. And of course I can explain it. If it's not explainable, it didn't happen. I can't believe that nonsense when people say that. I hear it all the time. Just because you can't explain something in totality to 100% doesn't mean you can't explain it. If you can't explain it, either one is illiterate or it didn't happen. Anything which is real and experienced must be explainable. There's a ton of DMT stories on YouTube. They are fascinating to hear, out of this world wacky. And I also want to point out that when I was saying this, I didn't accuse him. I said, I can't believe that nonsense when people say that. Right? I didn't say direct that at him. And when I said, if you can't explain it, either one is illiterate or it didn't happen, not either you are illiterate or it didn't happen. I just find that's a neat little way to be less confrontational or aggressive or seem like you're attacking someone else when you want to really emphasize a point and basically say that it's stupid. So you can use those other words, kind of like a euphemism. Continuing on, I said, and yes, DMT was the absolute wackiest, strangest thing I have ever done. But sure, I can explain it. Again, you can't explain it 100%, but that's the same with everything. You can't explain what a leaf is, or a human, or pride, 100%. Can't explain anything 100%, but you can do it good enough so someone else understands what you're talking about. Just because a phenomenon cannot be explained does not make it magic, nor unknowable, nor unexplainable. It just means we don't know yet. If I were to ask you how is electricity possible, you wouldn't know. Doesn't make it untrue. Someone out there knows. We don't know exactly how biology works. Doesn't mean that the human body doesn't work. So he tells me he had an experience where he experienced some kind of telepathy with a friend. And I said, okay, cool. I'm not going to believe him outright, but it's like, okay, maybe that's possible. Maybe that did happen. Okay, cool. If he experienced it, all right. I'm not going to say, yes, I believe that, but all right. And he says, tell me how what I said is possible within your worldview. And I said, I don't bloody know, man. I'm not an omniscient genius. I'm a man and I have limits. I don't know everything. And so he says, I'm not asking for the truth, I'm asking what you think. Okay, fair enough. I hadn't read that yet, but I had replied. I don't know how planes fly, how to build a skyscraper, or how the internet works, but I have proof those things are real. I don't need to understand them in totality to know they are real. And so he says to me, I don't have a full understanding of anything we've been talking about, and yet I believe to be true. Not a good sign. Perhaps you could say, I know it to be true, he says, but knowing is reserved for very, very concrete beliefs I have. I don't cross those lines easily. And so I was like, okay, I got to send him this video I made about faith versus knowing. So I sent that across. And I've also said, when you know a concrete, there is no belief. And a concrete is something that's concretized, like you can point to a table with pride. That's an abstract concept, right? But you can point to a concrete example of pride, say when someone is proven to be wrong, when they believe something incorrect, and then you can look at that demonstration and that person goes, oh, okay, yeah, I was wrong. All right, I'll change my mind and go to the thing that's right. People are only able to do that when they're proud. When someone's humble, they won't change their mind because they feel threatened. They feel like you're trying to kill them when you're trying to help them see the truth. Again, that's the whole big point of this conversation I'm reading out as well, of learning what not to do. When you know a concrete, there is no belief. I know this table's here. I don't believe it. Knowingness erases belief by default. You can't believe when you know, because you know. You only believe when you don't know. And so he says to me, already I see you exist in a plane of reality with tangible boundaries. I operate within, but also outside these boundaries. So that's what he says to me. And then he also continues, unfortunately, your potential for greatness is capped. Your idea is very flawed. It's all based on evidence. How do you think inventions were created? They didn't have evidence. So silly. 20 minutes in, I think he must have actually watched 20 minutes of my video. That's a good start. But he says, 20 minutes in, you sounded like my close-minded father. Good night. He can't see his blind spots. And so I just replied to him, you should have thought about this before you said it. Same with this and this, replying to each paragraph of comments or messages in the thread. The first one was when he said, already I see you exist in a plane of reality with tangible boundaries. Well, duh! Obviously, I can't just magically transform into a frog right now. I can't jump up from the ground and start flying. I can't breathe fire. I can't make all the beautiful women in the world love me and want to jump in my bed. There's boundaries in this world, and I have to operate within them. You cannot operate outside of the boundaries. That's just such an unknowing thing to say. It's almost like an AI that just doesn't understand reality because it's never actually, it's not even an alive thing. It's only repeating words that it's come across on the data it has available to it. Because how could you even think something like that? He says, I operate within, but also outside these boundaries. No, you can't. That's totally illogical. It's irrational. It's like playing a computer game that has a particular map. And obviously, everyone can only play on that map. You cannot go outside the map. But then he's saying, I also play outside the map. It's like, no, you don't. There's literally nothing outside that game's map. It's like the definition of nothing. Not empty space. There's literally not a map outside the boundaries of the map. You cannot be outside those boundaries. Not possible. It's like even if there was an omnipotent God, it's like if that God cannot create a rock heavy enough that he cannot lift, then he's not omnipotent. It's like a logical fallacy, right? Because no matter how powerful a being is or a God is, if he does create a rock that's too heavy for him to lift, well then he's not strong enough to lift it, which means he's not all powerful. And if he can lift the rock, right, then he can't make a rock that's too heavy for himself. So you can't get outside particular boundaries of reality. It's just, they are the boundaries of what is. Well, that's the primacy of existence, not consciousness. Your consciousness isn't all powerful. It has a lot of power, but it cannot be all powerful. Sorry, that's just the way it is. You know, sometimes I wish it was all powerful and you do whatever you want. But it's not like that, no matter how much you want that. That's not the truth. And he says, your idea is very flawed. It's all based on evidence. So he's trying to attack me and pull down my character, and then later on he calls me arrogant because I know things based on evidence and I don't believe things based on feelings. Oh my goodness, what has the humble done? This is how humility turns into hubris. How paradoxically the humble are arrogant. It's astounding, but it's also fascinating at the same time that this is possible. Like, how is this possible? It's crazy. How do you think inventions were created? They didn't have evidence. Of course they did. Of course they did. How would they? Go back to when someone was trying to create the wheel. They didn't just create the wheel out of magical thin air. The idea just sprung into their minds. No, they saw how a rock would roll, but some square item would not roll. And then you start building on. This is like the method of induction, not deduction. Induction is seeing how things actually work in reality, than making a generalization. A round type of rock like this, or a piece of wood that's round and circular, this starts to roll, but something flat or square, that doesn't roll. Perhaps all like circular things roll, and then if I carve it out and then I shape it more and create a wheel, that's gonna be useful, right? Every invention requires evidence. Otherwise it's impossible. Everything requires evidence. It's like saying and thinking that everything you do is based upon no reason. And I don't mean unreasonable, but on literally no reason. It's like, why do you eat? I don't know, I just eat. Well, no, you eat because you're hungry and to survive. It's like thinking, why do you read the Bible and believe in that? I don't know, I just do. No, it's because you have no confidence and trust in your own mind and you've abandoned reason, and therefore you are seeking something to guide you outside of yourself because you have no self-esteem and pride and you can't trust yourself, so you must trust someone else who sounds more confident than you. There's reasons for everything that everyone do. Most often they're not reasonable, but there's still reasons. That's what they're saying. What he's saying here, your idea is very flawed. It's all based on evidence. What? That's just... Again, yeah. Anyway. And so, in response to all that, all I said was, you should have thought about this before you said it. And then he replies, it's true, man. You don't know what you don't know. Yeah, of course, that's absolutely true. I agree with that. And he continues and says, it's quite funny, I find it, that you've devoted so much of yourself to standing in front of this camera, preaching to yourself about what you believe to know. You come across as incredibly arrogant, so in love with your own ideas, and you're so flawed. But like I said, you can't see your blind spots, and who am I to tell you otherwise? Enjoy your life, brother. It's like, dude, do you not understand the definition of brother, just to begin with? It's like, I'm not your brother. We don't even have any common interests. I'm trying to teach you here. I'm going out of my way to be generous and offer information, and you launch a barrage of insults and character attacks at me, and you have the audacity to call me brother? What's wrong with you, man? And so I didn't say that. I said, the old ad hominem, what an aggressor is reduced to when they can't find legitimate fault in another's argument. I'm disappointed that you met my expectations. Oh well, because I did expect something like this, because it's very rare that I find people who have not just intellect, but the desire and willingness to learn and to better themselves, who are proud and who care about their own well-being. I find that's extremely rare, and I didn't expect it from this guy, but I thought I'd try anyway to see what I could teach him and to see if I could learn anything. And I have learned. And I also continued and wrote more. I said, a lot of character attacks being aimed at me for simply being encouraged to think. I think that says a lot more about your character than it does mine. And he continues, and at that point I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to reply to this guy anymore, but he sent more messages. And all he could say in response to that was, it's your character where your fault lies. What else can I say? You can explain away whatever you want. It's not like you'll listen to me given you're so invested. It's not like you'll listen to me given you've invested so much in yourself. And again, he's saying that like it's a bad thing to invest in yourself. It's like, that's painful. It's painful to hear that. That someone would consider another investing in themselves as their greatest asset, and that sling that as a derogatory insult. And he continues and he says, besides, you'll happily say derogatory things about Christians in your video. Yeah, sure, in a video. You'll point out how childish it is to think what I think. Because I'm trying to help and point out the truth. And he says, seems pretty okay for me to call you arrogant. I mean it, but I don't mean it as an attack. I was like, okay, I can kind of see that, right? It's just like me saying that childish thing. But he continues and he says, if I called you an arrogant prick, that's a bit more of an attack. And I did my best not to. Lol, believe me, I wanted to. I'm like, okay, that means you practically did just call me an arrogant prick. Like, at least I hope he realized that's what he was doing. It's funny, but it's sad. It's funny because it's sad. And humor is just, I don't know, for myself, a defensive mechanism, so then it just doesn't go into just pure pain and grief that this human is part of my species. I don't even like to say that. That sounds insulting to myself, that people can think that. And it's not from, and I don't say that because of all the errors and flaws he had in all his thinking, but how this ended. Because we can all go through errors. You know, I've been wrong plenty of times. When people have presented to me information which contradicts the beliefs I had, and they say, hey, hold on, that's stupid, James, that's a bad way of thinking, here's the answer. And I go, oh, holy shit, yeah, that's right, changed my mind. That's the problem here. He's not doing that. It's not the errors he holds, it's the attitude towards people who know better, who 100% know better. And those who are prideful will always appear arrogant to those who are not. And this man has no pride. That's why he can believe such garbage and nonsense and not feel it absolutely necessary to change his mind when presented with ideas that show how those ideas are wrong. And so it's upsetting. How humility turns into hubris. So I hope you've learned a lot from this video. Some tactics I use when speaking to people directly via video, and some errors not to make. Don't be humble. Don't use faith. Be proud. Have respect for yourself. Don't use faith. Use reason. Reason is the only means to understand yourself and reality. It's the only means to communicate with other people. Even when people reduce themselves to a status of a human and behave suboptimally, even then you can still be proud and you still don't have to sling a whole bunch of insults. Though they would be warranted and totally understandable if you did want to do that if you're in my situation. I'm not saying never to throw insults at some people. Sometimes they really do deserve it and it can feel good and maybe it'll help them change their mind. But you don't have to do it. You can be above that as well. Pick and choose, it's up to you. Yeah, again, so hopefully I really do hope you learned something from that. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.